What would you do if someone tried to kick you out of a place where you were invited? If a stranger looked you in the eye and decided you didn't belong, no matter the truth? That's exactly what happened when Zara Mitchell stepped into Briarwood Country Club. But what started as a simple day by the pool turned into a confrontation no one expected, especially not Mrs. Kingsley. How did it end? Watch until the end to find out. Like, subscribe, and share this story now. The heat was suffocating. The kind that pressed against your skin and made every movement feel like an effort. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the city streets as Zara Mitchell sat on the front steps of her house, absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. She was waiting for Emma Wallace, her best friend since middle school and, at least for today, her ticket into Briarwood Country Club, a place she had never set foot in before, a place she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to be. "Come on, Zara, it'll be fun," Emma had practically begged over the phone the night before. "I don't know, Em." Zara had hesitated, shifting the phone to her other ear. "Oh, don't start," Emma cut in before she could say no outright. "You always say you don't fit in, but that's just in your head. My mom already put you on the guest list. End of story. I'm picking you up at noon." And just like that, Zara had agreed. But now, sitting in the heat, waiting for Emma's sleek black car to pull up, she felt that familiar tightness in her chest. Briarwood wasn't just any country club. It was a symbol of old money, legacy, and exclusivity. People didn't just pay to be members. They had to be invited. Generations of wealth passed through its halls, names engraved on plaques, families with deep roots and deeper pockets. And Zara knew exactly what kind of people thrived in places like that. Not her. The sound of an engine pulling into the driveway broke her thoughts. Emma rolled down the window, grinning ear to ear. "Get in, loser. We're going swimming." Zara let out a small laugh, shaking her head as she grabbed her tote bag and slid into the passenger seat. "You sound way too excited about this," she muttered. "Because I am." Emma flicked on her sunglasses dramatically before pulling onto the road. "You're going to love it, Z. The pool's huge, the food is amazing, and let's not forget about the lifeguards." Zara snorted. "I knew there was an ulterior motive." Emma gasped in mock offense. "How dare you accuse me of such shallow intentions?" She smirked before adding, "Even if you're right." They drove in comfortable silence for a moment, the city streets slowly giving way to winding suburban roads, lined with towering trees and perfectly manicured lawns. But as they got closer, Zara felt that tightness in her chest return. She fiddled with the strap of her bag. "Are you sure they won't have a problem with me being there?" Emma sighed dramatically, flicking her turn signal. "Zara, you are my guest. My mom literally put your name on the list. There's no way they can say anything. And besides, I dare someone to try." She said it with so much confidence that for a second, Zara almost believed her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The entrance to Briarwood Country Club was a statement all on its own. A grand, wrought iron gate stood tall, flanked by towering hedges that looked as if they had been trimmed with a ruler. Beyond it, a white Mediterranean-style mansion gleamed under the sunlight, complete with grand archways and columns that screamed old money. Emma pulled up to the security booth and gave the attendant a quick wave. "Hey, it's me. My mom put my friend on the guest list." The guard barely glanced at Zara before nodding and pressing the button. The gates swung open smoothly, and just like that, they were in. Zara exhaled. So far, so good. As they pulled into the valet circle, Emma tossed her keys to the waiting attendant like she'd done it 1,000 times. Zara, meanwhile, clutched her bag a little tighter as they walked toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby was cool and pristine, with marble floors that shone under the chandelier light. The receptionist, an older woman in a crisp white uniform, glanced up as they approached. Emma leaned casually against the counter. Wallace, +1. The woman barely looked at the list before nodding. You're all set, Miss Wallace. Enjoy your day. No questions, no second glances, and just like that they were in. Zara let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. The scent of chlorine and sunscreen hit them as soon as they stepped outside. The pool area was massive, surrounded by striped lounge chairs and private cabanas draped in white curtains. Waiters dressed in crisp uniforms moved effortlessly between guests, refilling glasses and delivering silver trays of snacks. It was the kind of place where the air felt different, heavier in a way Zara couldn't quite explain. Emma, on the other hand, looked completely at home. Told you it's nice, she said, nudging Zara's arm playfully. Zara smirked. All right, you win. They found 2 open lounge chairs near the edge of the pool, right under the shade of a large umbrella. Zara dropped her bag, slipping off her sandals and stretching her legs out with a sigh. For a brief moment, she let herself relax. Maybe, just maybe, she had been overthinking everything. It was subtle. A glance. A quick flicker of the eyes from a woman sitting a few chairs away, sipping her iced tea. Zara felt it instantly. The once-over, the kind that lingered just a second too long. It wasn't outright hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. She had seen it before. She had felt it before. And suddenly the relaxation she had felt evaporated. Zara didn't say anything. She just exhaled, sinking further into her chair, hoping she was wrong, hoping that today would be different, but deep down she knew. It never was. And the day had only just begun. The afternoon sun was at its peak, beating down on the shimmering turquoise waters of the Briarwood Country Club pool. The scent of chlorine, sunscreen, and freshly cut grass mixed in the air as Zara Mitchell and Emma Wallace strolled across the pool deck. Zara had finally started to relax. The tension from earlier, the small glances, the subconscious worry, had begun to fade into the background. Maybe Emma had been right. Maybe this day really was just about lounging by the pool, eating overpriced snacks and pretending they had no responsibilities. As they reached their lounge chairs, Zara untied the wrap around her waist, revealing her sleek navy blue swimsuit. The cool breeze felt good against her skin, a welcome contrast to the heat radiating off the pavement. "See, I told you this place is amazing," Emma said, stretching dramatically before pulling her hair into a ponytail. "Come on, let's get in the water." Zara nodded, stepping toward the pool's edge. The water shimmered invitingly, and she felt a small flicker of excitement. She dipped her toes in, and then a voice. Sharp, clipped, like the crack of a whip. "Excuse me, young lady." Zara froze. The sound sliced through the lazy hum of the pool deck, sending a ripple of silence through the air. Slowly she turned, and there she was. Eleanor Kingsley stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her pastel sundress, lips pursed into a thin line. Everything about her radiated authority, not the kind that came from an actual title, but the kind of power that came from entitlement, from years of being the one who made the rules, the one who never got questioned. Her silver hair was styled to perfection, her manicured nails gleamed under the sun, and her icy blue eyes locked onto Zara like she was inspecting a misplaced object. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Kingsley said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But this pool is for members only." There was no hesitation in her voice, no room for discussion. And in that moment, Zara knew exactly what this was. Zara had 2 choices. She could let the moment pass, apologize, pretend like she had made a mistake, and quietly step away. Or she could do what she had been taught to do her whole life. She could stand her ground. She straightened her shoulders, her heartbeat steady, and said calmly but firmly, "I'm a guest. Emma's guest. She signed me in. Mrs. Kingsley's eyes barely flicked to Emma before snapping back to Zara. As if Emma was irrelevant, as if the problem wasn't about club policies. Emma, of course, wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. "Mrs. Kingsley," she said, her voice filled with thinly veiled irritation, "my mom added Zara to the guest list. She's allowed to be here. You can check with the front desk if you'd like." But Mrs. Kingsley wasn't listening. She wasn't interested in rules. She wasn't interested in checking facts. She was interested in one thing and one thing only, making sure Zara second-guessed herself. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The world seemed to slow as Zara became hyper-aware of everything around her. The subtle way conversations had quieted, the way people at nearby lounge chairs had stopped pretending to look away. They were watching, waiting. Some were curious, others were expectant, and Zara knew what they wanted. They wanted her to do what people like her were expected to do in these situations. They wanted her to apologize, to step back, to disappear quietly so everything could go back to normal. Zara inhaled slowly, the tension in her chest growing heavier. She had lived this moment before. Maybe not here, maybe not exactly like this, but she had felt the same energy, the same expectations. Mrs. Kingsley had already decided she was in the wrong before she even opened her mouth. Nothing Zara said would change that, so she didn't try to convince her. Instead, she met Mrs. Kingsley's gaze, steady, unwavering, refusing to shrink under the weight of her stare. "You can check with the front desk," Zara said, her voice even controlled, "but I'm not going anywhere." Emma, standing beside her, let out an exasperated scoff, throwing her hands up. "Oh my God, this is ridiculous," she snapped. "You literally saw me sign her in." Mrs. Kingsley didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly as if considering something before sighing dramatically. "I don't mean to be difficult," she said in a syrupy, sweet tone, "but we have policies for a reason. It keeps things organized. Organized. That word sat heavy in the air. It wasn't about organization. It was about control, about deciding who belonged and who didn't." Zara clenched her jaw. "It's fine," she muttered, reaching for her bag. "Let's go talk to the front desk." Emma grabbed her arm, her face burning with frustration. "No, we are not walking away from this." Zara didn't respond right away. She could still feel the weight of a dozen eyes on her, hovering at the edge of her vision. Some people pretended not to notice. Others were watching openly, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, just as she was about to say something, a voice boomed across the pool deck. "I told you she needs to leave." Zara sat up straight. Mrs. Kingsley was back, but this time she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a tall, wiry man in a navy polo, his club name tag gleaming under the sun. Security. Emma shot to her feet. "Are you serious right now?" she hissed. Mrs. Kingsley's smile was tight, but her eyes gleamed with triumph. "If there was a miscommunication, I do apologize," she said, her voice thick with fake politeness. "But non-members can't use the pool. It's a simple policy." The security officer hesitated, his gaze flicking between the three of them. Uncertain, uneasy, because even he could feel it, something about this wasn't right. But before he could make a decision, before Zara or Emma could even speak, a deep voice interrupted. "I think that's a great idea." And just like that, everything stopped. For a second, the only sound Zara could hear was the distant splash of water, the faint rustling of leaves in the summer breeze, and the hum of whispered conversations lingering just beyond her reach. The moment hung in the air, thick with expectation, as Alina Kingsley tilted her chin slightly, the kind of subtle movement that said she knew she was in control. Then, with a sharp flick of her wrist, she gestured toward the security guard standing nearby. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice laced with faux politeness. Could you assist us over here? Zara's stomach dropped. This wasn't about the rules. This wasn't about the guest list. This was about power. Who had it, who didn't, and who was expected to quietly step aside when confronted with it. A tall, wiry man in a navy polo with the Briarwood Country Club insignia embroidered on his chest hesitated before walking over. His name tag read H. Reed, but something about his face told Zara that he wasn't exactly thrilled to be dragged into this. "Ma'am," he asked cautiously, glancing between Mrs. Kingsley and Zara. Mrs. Kingsley gave him a tight-lipped smile, tilting her head toward Zara. "There seems to be some confusion," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate. "This young lady is attempting to use the facilities without being a member." Zara felt a wave of heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment but from the utter predictability of it all. Emma stepped forward before Zara could react, her hands clenched into fists. "That's not true," she snapped. "My mom put Zara on the guest list. If you don't believe me, why don't you check with the front desk instead of just taking her word for it?" Security Officer Reed hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. That hesitation was all Zara needed to see. If Mrs. Kingsley had called about anyone else, security would have asked questions. They would have verified before assuming wrongdoing. But in this case, an accusation alone was enough to summon enforcement. That was the real issue here, and everyone watching knew it. The energy around the pool had shifted. People weren't just watching casually anymore. They were really watching, some of them turning their heads slightly, pretending to be absorbed in their drinks but still listening intently. The lifeguard nearby adjusted his sunglasses, pretending to scan the pool, but Zara saw the way his head was tilted just enough to hear every word. A couple lounging under a nearby cabana had gone completely silent, their conversation forgotten. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to be the person who spoke up, but they all wanted to see how it played out. Zara could feel her pulse thrumming in her ears, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer," she said, her tone even, controlled, "I'm not breaking any rules. I was signed in properly. If you check with the front desk, you'll see that." Reed shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. He could feel it too, but Mrs. Kingsley let out a small, amused chuckle, shaking her head slightly. "I don't mean to be difficult," she said, feigning exasperation, "but we have policies for a reason. We can't just let people walk in because they say they're on the list." Emma looked ready to explode. "She's not just saying it. I saw my mom add her to the list. This is insane." Mrs. Kingsley ignored her completely, her gaze still locked onto Zara. That's when Zara realized this wasn't just about getting her to leave the pool. This was about getting her to feel small enough to leave on her own. Mrs. Kingsley wasn't just questioning her status. She was waiting for Zara to be the one to step back, to shrink under the weight of the stairs, to give up so she didn't have to be forced out. But Zara wasn't about to let that happen. Just when Zara opened her mouth to respond, a deep, commanding voice sliced through the tense air. "I think checking the guest list is an excellent idea." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight, the kind that made everything stop. Zara didn't need to turn around to know who it belonged to. The entire pool deck fell into an eerie silence. The lifeguard, who had been pretending not to listen, sat up a little straighter. The couple who had been lounging under the cabana completely stopped pretending to read their magazines. Mrs. Kingsley's face went pale, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. Even Officer Reed straightened his posture instinctively. Because standing just beyond the lounge chairs, hands casually in his pockets, was Governor Nathaniel Mitchell. Zara turned toward him, her pulse still racing, but her breath finally steadying. Her father's expression was unreadable, calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm. He wasn't a man who barked orders. He didn't yell to assert dominance. He didn't need to. Nathaniel Mitchell had spent years in politics, but his real strength wasn't in speeches or campaign promises. It was in moments like this. Moments where people realized, too late, exactly who they were messing with. Mrs. Kingsley's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, because what could she possibly say? She had just tried to kick out the daughter of the man whose name was engraved on the donor wall near the entrance of the club. And now, he was standing right in front of her. For a moment, no one moved. Mrs. Kingsley was frozen in place, her mind clearly scrambling for a way to talk herself out of the corner she had backed into. The security officer, who had seemed so hesitant before, now looked visibly uncomfortable, as if he suddenly realized he might have made a huge mistake. Zara, standing beside Emma, felt a slow, quiet confidence settle into her chest. She had known this wasn't over. And now, neither did Mrs. Kingsley. Nathaniel Mitchell took one step forward, his gaze locked onto Mrs. Kingsley's, and in a voice so calm it was almost dangerous, he said, "You seem very concerned about my daughter's presence here. I'd love to know why." A heavy silence settled over the Briarwood Country Club pool deck. The water, once alive with splashes and laughter, felt eerily still. Conversations had faded into hushed whispers, and all eyes, subtle or not, were locked onto the man who had just spoken. Governor Nathaniel Mitchell. His presence alone had shifted the balance of power in an instant. As he stepped forward, his polished shoes tapped softly against the stone pavement, a measured, deliberate sound that sent an unmistakable message. This was a man in control. Eleanor Kingsley, who just moments ago had stood tall with an air of unshakable authority, now visibly stiffened. Her posture remained rigid, but her fingers twitched at her sides, a small betrayal of her discomfort. She had expected to win this battle. She had expected Zara to back down. What she hadn't expected was for Zara's father, the governor of the state, to step in and address her directly. And now, she was trapped in a moment she had no control over. Beside her, the security officer shifted awkwardly, his hands clasped in front of him, clearly wishing he was anywhere else but here. Nathaniel Mitchell's eyes remained calm, steady, unreadable. And then, in a tone so polite it was almost unsettling, he asked, "Did you personally check the guest list before calling security?" Officer Reed, the security guard, hesitated. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if he was struggling to decide whether to tell the truth or say what Mrs. Kingsley wanted him to say. Finally, after a beat too long, he cleared his throat and admitted, "We were just responding to a complaint, sir." There it was. Zara felt the weight of those words settle into the pit of her stomach. Her father's expression didn't change, but Zara had spent enough years watching him handle tense situations to recognize the slight shift in his jaw, a small but unmistakable sign of controlled irritation. "I see," Nathaniel said evenly. He turned his attention back to Mrs. Kingsley, who was now visibly uncomfortable, though still trying to mask it with composed indifference. "So," Nathaniel continued, "an accusation alone was enough to have security remove a teenage girl." Mrs. Kingsley let out a short, breathy laugh, the kind people use when they realize they're in trouble but don't want to admit it yet. "Governor Mitchell," she started, forcing a smile, "this is just a misunderstanding. I was merely ensuring that club policies were being followed." She spoke as though she was still in control of the situation, as if she could explain this away like it was a minor inconvenience, a simple miscommunication. But Nathaniel wasn't interested in excuses. His gaze remained locked onto hers, unwavering. "Were you?" he asked, his voice as calm as ever. Mrs. Kingsley blinked. Something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty, hesitation. She knew she was losing control of the narrative. And Nathaniel was going to make sure everyone here knew it too. Nathaniel took a step forward, keeping his voice even and composed. "Briarwood Country Club prides itself on being exclusive," he said. Mrs. Kingsley nodded quickly, as if grasping onto a lifeline. "Yes, of course," she interjected, eager to steer the conversation away from where she knew it was going. But Nathaniel wasn't done. "But," he continued, "I'd hate to think exclusivity is being confused with discrimination." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable, and everyone heard them. A visible shudder ran through Mrs. Kingsley's composure, her breath catching just slightly. There it was, the exact thing she had been trying to avoid. Because discrimination wasn't just an uncomfortable word. It was a word that carried weight, implications, and consequences. And now, it had been spoken aloud in front of dozens of witnesses. Mrs. Kingsley's face had paled considerably, her confidence crumbling at the edges. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't make her look worse. So instead, she did the only thing left to do. She turned sharply on her heel, her sandals clicking against the pavement, and walked away in silence. The security officer hesitated, his eyes darting between Nathaniel, Zara, and Mrs. Kingsley's retreating figure. He cleared his throat and in a voice that lacked the authority it had earlier, muttered, "Enjoy your day." Then, he too walked away, following after Mrs. Kingsley like a soldier retreating from a lost battle. For a moment, Zara just stood there, taking in what had just happened. She could still feel the weight of the stares around them, but this time, they weren't watching to see if she would shrink away. They were watching because they had just witnessed something they hadn't expected, Mrs. Kingsley losing control of the situation she had so confidently started. Zara turned to her father, who had already shifted his focus back to her. His expression wasn't one of triumph. It wasn't smug or arrogant. It was steady, certain, reassuring. "You okay?" he asked simply. Zara exhaled. She was still processing everything. The frustration, the anger, the way her presence alone had been enough to trigger this entire ordeal. She wasn't okay, but she would be, so she nodded. "Yeah, Dad, I'm good." Nathaniel nodded once. "All right then," he said, his tone light, casual, like he hadn't just dismantled a woman's entire sense of authority in front of an audience. He took a seat in one of the lounge chairs, unbothered as if nothing had happened. And just like that, it was over. But Zara knew it wasn't really over, because she had stood her ground today, and everyone who had been watching, they had seen the truth. The sun was still shining, the pool water still shimmering under the golden light, and yet everything felt different. The air wasn't quite as heavy, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Zara Mitchell let out a slow breath, steadying herself, but she could still feel the residual tightness in her chest, the kind of tension that didn't just disappear because the confrontation had ended. She glanced toward the far end of the pool deck, where Mrs. Kingsley had vanished minutes earlier, her retreat a silent admission of defeat. But even now, Zara knew this wasn't really over, not for her, not for people like her. She turned back toward her father, who sat comfortably in a lounge chair like he hadn't just dismantled a woman's entire sense of power in front of an audience. His calm presence had always been something of a mystery to her. Even when faced with situations like this, he never seemed rattled, never seemed like he was carrying the weight of these moments, though she knew he had carried far more of them than she ever had. And maybe that was the difference. Maybe she was still learning what it meant to navigate these spaces, spaces that would always demand proof of her belonging, no matter how many times she had already earned her place. And that's what sat heavy in her chest now. "Why did I still have to prove I belonged here, even after being invited?" Zara asked, her voice quiet but steady. Emma, still sitting beside her, was fuming. She scoffed, shaking her head, her arms crossed so tightly that Zara was surprised she wasn't cutting off her own circulation. "I just don't get it," Emma muttered. "I thought things like this didn't happen anymore." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and Zara knew exactly what she meant. Emma wasn't naive. She knew the world wasn't perfect. She had heard stories. She had seen things on the news, but there was something different about seeing it unfold right in front of you. About watching a person you care about be singled out for no reason other than the fact that someone decided they didn't belong. Nathaniel Mitchell finally looked up from his phone, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp, knowing. "A lot of people think that," he said, giving Emma a small, patient smile. "Until they see it happen right in front of them." Emma didn't respond right away. She just sat there, lips pressing into a thin line as if trying to grapple with the reality of it all. Zara understood now. This wasn't the first time and it wouldn't be the last. It didn't matter if she was invited. It didn't matter if she followed the rules. For people like Mrs. Kingsley, none of that would have made a difference, because Mrs. Kingsley hadn't been looking for a violation of policy. She had been looking for an excuse. But today, she had been forced to confront her own bias, and more importantly, everyone at the club had seen it too. Zara didn't know if any of them would talk about it later, if any of them would sit around their dinner tables tonight and whisper about what had happened at the pool. But she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't pretend they hadn't seen it. They couldn't ignore it, and maybe that mattered. Even if it didn't change everything overnight, it mattered. Because Mrs. Kingsley had expected Zara to shrink away, to feel small enough to leave without a fight. And instead, Zara had done the one thing that took away her power. She hadn't moved. And that was something Mrs. Kingsley wouldn't forget. Zara didn't feel small anymore. She didn't feel like someone who was being allowed to exist here. She felt like someone who belonged here. Because she did. And no one, not Mrs. Kingsley, not anyone watching from the sidelines, not even the security officer who hesitated too long, could make her feel otherwise. Nathaniel stood then, stretching his arms like he had just finished a casual business meeting, and gave her an approving nod. "You stood your ground today," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. Zara met his eyes. "Not every battle has to be fought," he continued. "But sometimes refusing to back down is a victory in itself." And somehow, that was enough. Emma, who had been simmering in her frustration, finally let out an exaggerated breath and shot Zara a look. "Okay, well, I vote we stop giving that woman any more space in our heads and go get some fries, because I need something deep fried and covered in salt after all of that." Zara laughed, the tension in her chest loosening just a little. "You and your food obsession," she teased. Emma placed a dramatic hand over her heart. "Excuse you, fries are a universal comfort food." "I don't make the rules." Nathaniel shook his head, amused. "I'll let you two figure that out," he said, already checking his phone as he started walking toward the clubhouse. "I've got a state to run." Zara watched him go for a moment, still processing everything. She knew she wouldn't forget this day, not what had happened, not the way people watched but said nothing. Not the way Mrs. Kingsley had expected her to shrink, only to be forced to walk away instead. But most of all, she wouldn't forget what it felt like to stand tall in a place where someone had tried to make her feel small. She picked up her bag, walking toward the snack bar with Emma. And this time, she walked a little taller, not because she had won a fight, but because she had refused to let someone else define her place. These moments happen everywhere all the time. Some people ignore them, some people stand by and watch, and some people speak up. So the next time you see injustice, don't just watch, say something. Because silence doesn't make you neutral, it makes you complicit. If this story made you think, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video. Your voice matters, use it.